Hey folks, my name is Ted and you are watching episode 27 of the Business of Cyber Show, where we talk about resources. CISOs, OT directors, IT directors, your average asset owners, they just don't have enough time, people, and budget to execute on their product and project roadmaps to keep their customers, their internal customers and their external customers safe. That's the entire premise for the Business of Cybersecurity show. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about NIST CSF and diving into NIST CSF. As you know, there were some recent changes to NIST CSF. It's one of the most widely used frameworks in the world. And so I have a really great guest, Omar Sikander, that I'd love to introduce. This is a great opportunity. Omar and I work together. We're always talking about different frameworks, different challenges within the OT and IT. And when we thought about what we wanted to talk about, this came up. He said, hey, look, I want to jump in and I want to have a conversation about this. So Omar, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here and taking the time to talk with me today.
Yeah, absolutely, Ted. Great to be on and be in studio here today. Pretty excited.
Yeah, absolutely. So just getting started, ladies and gentlemen, the agenda doesn't change. We're going to add one thing called a teamwork timeout. We did it in 2023. This is where individuals from the market are either looking for an opportunity or they're looking for some more people to join their particular team. We're going to talk about two different asset owners that have roles open. Then we're going to go right into the NIST CSF deep dive. We've got 5 or 6 major topics about how different organizations try, sometimes fail, sometimes succeed, how to succeed better when you're trying to use NIST CSF in an OT specific environment, and what are the things you have to look out for. The one thing that I would love to share and hope to see are comments from the actual folks that are watching online live. 2 episodes ago, we had probably 40 different comments from different folks with one of our guests, and it was really encouraging to hear the feedback as well as the questions. If it's applicable, I will throw it up into the chat, and that way the majority of us can see it. And if you don't want to be true, just go ahead and hide your overall comments. But with that, let's go ahead and dive in, and let's just go here. Omar, tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of where your background comes from, and where do you see NIST CSF on a regular basis in your work?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks again for the opportunity. So Omar Sikander, Solutions Engineer for SecurityGate. I've been with the company for about 2 years, but interestingly as well, most of my career was spent under the Rockwell Automation family. So came out of Texas A&M University as an industrial engineer and joined the Rockwell Automation sales training program. Gave me a pretty unique perspective in OT. I got to start my career right about when Stuxnet was becoming popular, or at least the happening of what Stuxnet did, which, in my opinion, really created the whole OT space, and been following OT and cybersecurity ever since. Unique vantage point because I got to work with a variety of different clients, customers, Fortune 500s, oil and gas, chemical, heavy industries, critical manufacturing, and I got to see different OT cybersecurity practices be stood up, and got to see what characteristics were evident for those that were achieving success and utilizing resources effectively versus those that maybe were trying to catch up and do better, right? So really glad to be on and share some perspective around what I've seen in my career as well as in recent past.
Yeah, I think there's everybody that I've ever worked with that has worked with you have said that you're a joy to be on the phone with, you're a joy to implement solutions with. And so I couldn't think of anybody better to talk about some of the core challenges with NIST CSF. So thanks for being a part of the show. As we backtrack a little bit here, I wanted to talk about a couple of positions that are open. For those of you who have not heard before what Teamwork Timeout is that this group, this industry, this culture that we have within the OT cybersecurity space, we got to talk to each other. We got to make each other better, right? So I last year put a Teamwork Timeout into the slide deck, and I stopped for some reason. I'm not sure why, but backed by popular demand, here are a couple roles that are open right now. If you know somebody that could be a great fit for a services key account manager for data centers, as well as a sales director, I know that the electrification group within ABB has some US-based positions that are open. Now, the unique part about Teamwork Timeout is that the way it works is if you know somebody that would recommend you for a job, or if you knew somebody that worked at that company, the intent here is in that little pink box, you have a thumbs up with that person. And sometimes I don't know that person, but in this particular case, I've worked with Mark before. He's the manager for the US marketing and sales team These particular roles are based out of Atlanta, but he runs the entire U.S. And so I give a thumbs up for their culture, where they're going, what they're doing. The electrification group has put a really big investment into the OT cybersecurity side, and I recommend anybody who is interested in working for that great OEM reach out. The second is here in Houston, Texas, a drilling company. Actually, 3 or 4 people that are currently on my team used to work at Noble Drilling, certified some of their first rigs back in when Shell had some contracts with them back in 2008, 9, 10, 11. I couldn't say more great things about the Noble team. I've also worked with Bemi before, who's leading their overall OT strategy. There's an audit manager role that's open here in Houston. It just got released, and I'd recommend that you reach out to him and the Noble team. I've had a really great chance over the course of the last 5 years to work with him, and he's unbelievable from a technical as well as a strategic perspective. Anybody on his team is going to grow into the best security leader that he or she can be. So that's our teamwork timeout. If you have any questions about these particular roles, or if you are looking for a new role, don't hesitate to reach out to me, and we can put you in next week. With that, let's get started, Omar. Let's talk about, I think we got almost 50, 60 people live right now, which is awesome. No, it's actually 75. We want to hear your comments, folks. NIST, we've got 4 or 5 different kind of very big picture statements. That's all we're going to put on slides. We're going to talk today. And the first thing I want to talk about is, how does NIST CSF, where does it fit? What is it? Let's just give a primer real quick for some of the beginners that are out there. What changes have you seen regularly? Give us everything as a primer there.
Yeah. So NIST CSF, cybersecurity framework, established around 2014, updated 2018, and then yesterday, big day yesterday, NIST 2.0 finally formally released to the public. Current iteration of NIST CSF is up to 6 core functions from 5. And they created the govern function, which really cross-cuts the original 5 functions of identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. Now, beneath those core functions, NIST establishes 22 categories, down from 23, and 106 subcategories, down from 108. So not a lot of adding, more optimizing the framework. But in general, the belief system around NIST and why this framework was created is they established this concept of the attack continuum, which you might have heard before, during, and after. What happens before an attack happens, as an attack is happening, and then after an attack happens. And then below that, they created these 6 core functions to guide, prescribe organizations to really prepare themselves within these 3 phases of a potential attack.
Right. So how do you feel? So if somebody's already got a bunch of different facilities assessed in the CSF in their current version, you switch over to tomorrow. How do you see companies managing that? Is this kind of optional, or are they going to start implementing the government function? Or they go back in time and go and reassess? How are you dealing with that, or how have you managed those questions?
Yeah, so exciting times, right? This was just released yesterday, and I don't want to make assumptions, but if you're asking for my expertise, if I was in a position, I know that my company, my organization is already aligned to 1.1, 2.0. I think is more of a structural revamp than a net new revamp. A lot of the subcategories and categories for the new function of governance actually were already requirements in the previous one. They're just kind of structured differently.
Right.
I wouldn't try to reinvent the wheel, right? I would just maintain the value that I'm getting from 1.1 and make a gradual change into structuring my assessments against 2.0 moving forward.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I think a lot of people, you and I live in the assessment space. NIST CSF, number 1 widely used in the world, across the globe, period, for both OT and I think critical environments. And I think we should take a little bit of time and say why that is. My perspective is that a lot of people want to, in the OT world or in the critical sector cyber world, they want to jump immediately to like a 62443. And I'm the biggest fan on earth of ISO Secure and what it's been able to do with that series of standards. But can you help illuminate what we talked about previously to this show, which is that NIST CSF is a controls gap framework, which really lays the foundation. Tell us why that is and how, without it being written anywhere, NIST CSF is actually really intertwined with some of your more complex risk assessments. Why is that, Omar?
Yeah, I would agree with that, Ted. as I shared before, NIST CSF is broad enough. The subcategories, right, the 106 now, 108 previous to yesterday, they're broad enough to where they can provide some guidance on what to do within that specific category, but they're specific enough as well that you can then tailor or further qualify how that control or requirement might apply to your organization, right? So it's broad yet specific at the same time, which I think is unique. And the fact that NIST CSF can be applied to both IT and OT, IT being much more mature than OT practices. And a lot of NIST CSF, if not in its entirety, can also be applied with OT with specific nuances around just an OT environment in mind.
Yeah. What I like about NIST CSF is that they told you kind of what to think about, where to kind of focus your efforts, but they didn't give you such granularity and specificity that you're telling you exactly how you should be thinking about it. You don't see tons of shall statements. You don't see tons of you will do this and there's every single bullet point. I think there's a time and a place for that. There's a lot of sector-driven frameworks and standards that you see that.
Yeah.
What I think it works best for is you have a series of controls that are deemed pretty necessary across any organization, from the very top of the organization down to the bottom. And when you can effectively understand what the gaps are there, then I see great security managers shifting over to, okay, what are my threats? What are my business outcomes that I'm trying to achieve? And what are the likelihood of those threats going to impact that? And I think only then, Omar, you can actually approach a really robust risk-based methodology, because you have this foundation and layers of data that you need. I'll give you the final thoughts before I ask you another question.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think in my career, 11 years-ish in OT cybersecurity, I've seen three types of risk assessment, assessments in general within cybersecurity. Gap assessments or compliance assessments, right? Yes, no, do I have it in place? Then as a cyber practice evolves or matures, it'll consider maturity assessments, where maybe you have a scale. 0 means I have no policy. 1 means I have an informal policy, up to 5 meaning I have an approved written policy, right? So that's just a natural evolution, same requirements, different way of measuring yourself.
Right.
And then you couple that with risk, right? Where you have some sort of threat, be it ransomware, which is quite popular at the board level. What is the likelihood and the severity of a ransomware attack propagating within my facility? So that then you can have a true landscape of your gaps, your maturity, and your risk across your enterprise.
Makes sense. Well, as we transition to how to actually use NIST CSF and OT, or more importantly, what are the specific nuances about OT that the assessment owner, driver, respondent should be thinking about? You know, are there some specific examples, maybe at the control level, control family level, where if you're in an OT environment, you're going to look at that control a little differently than you're in an IT, because this is where the rubber meets the road when someone's actually assessing in their own facility. Can you illuminate that a little bit for us?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, you had Daniel here 2 weeks ago, which gave really great perspective around the differences of IT and OT. And if I can expand on that with a specific detail, right? And before I go into that detail, you know, just for those of you that haven't caught that episode, the idea around priorities for IT and OT are different, right? In IT, if email servers go down, people complain, but you're typically back up and running and no one gets hurt. That's different in OT. If things go wrong in OT, people could get hurt, things explode. So with that as the premise, some of the differences around just the installed base, for example. So there's a control or a subcategory, I should say, within this CSF 2.0, ID-AM.8, and it has to do with lifecycle management of software and hardware systems. From what I've seen in my career, brownfield facilities, right? So a facility, when I call it brownfield, it means that it's been existing, it's got an installed base. That installed base typically has two tenets. That installed base is both legacy and disparate. Legacy in the sense that you could have devices like PLCs, IO, electrical equipment that's anywhere from 10 to 20 years old, and disparate in the sense that you could have ABB, you could have Rockwell, Siemens, Schneider Electric installed base within the facility, and you got to make it all work. That's totally different than IT. Life cycles in IT, instead of being 10 to 20 years, they're more 5 to 7. Instead of being, disparate, they're more homogeneous. you have all Mac or all Windows or whatever the case may be, right? So just with that as the issue that this particular control is trying to address within OT, you need to have a handle on your lifecycle strategy, right? And within IT, it's a little more mature. Within OT, definitely have to manage the legacy and disparate. I've seen plant managers that they go with the Ted Lasso approach or the hope and a prayer approach, where he just hits the believe sign before he goes home to bed, because that PLC is running all the critical systems in the facility, and if that baby goes down,
Right.
not even eBay can save him anymore, right? So just wanted to give some perspective there on one of the nuances that I've seen.
Well, the word life cycle is an important one, right? One of the biggest things about deploying any assessment, specifically NIST CSF, is what's your scope and what's the meaning behind some of the syntax, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it is important to understand life cycle throughout the life cycle, because if the life cycle is just based on vulnerabilities, or if the life cycle is based on the end of life for that particular business operation, I think that drives a different answer on the status of that control. Would you not agree?
Yeah, totally.
Which is also brings up a bigger point, which says, what are we looking for in a NIST CSF assessment for OT? Are we looking at it because we're trying to get a certain score?
Mm-hmm.
I don't disagree with a compliance-based orientation, right? What I think OT environments have to strive for is they have to define very clearly what is going to be the scope, what is the definition of all these core figures, with the full intent that all they're trying to do is understand where their gaps are, where they want to lay over compensating controls. And they're actually using this data model from this CSF as a foundational layer to build to their next stage of maturity. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges. Anything else on the specific, another example you could give on how OT might be different than IT on the actual control level?
Yeah, this one will probably hit home, right? If you've been keeping up with cybersecurity, especially in the IT place, I would say that any IT pro worth their salt would suggest that if you enable multi-factor authentication, it will be the most effective risk-reducing control for enterprise authentication, right? But the idea of deploying multi-factor authentication in an OT environment, you've got to consider nuances, right? Because heaven forbid, you work at a manufacturing facility, you've got one of your good coworkers that's right next to a robot, and for whatever reason that robot malfunctions, and your coworker's in a precarious situation. You can't just holler at him and be like, hey man, give me a moment while your arm's being squished, right? Let me MFA into the machine so I can hit the e-stop. That just can't happen. So that's just another example that comes from the PR.AA category within NIST CSF, which is around identity management, authentication, access control, just to give you some perspective on how things just might be a little different. You can't just MFA everything within a production environment.
Well, and it is even deeper than that. I've seen actually machine shops where the login credentials having to be coming up and how often that refreshes, that it'll actually significantly slow down business operations just because they're having to keep logging in. So it's very interesting. It's very interesting how business-oriented OT systems and you secure them versus IT-oriented systems and how you secure them. I think that the biggest challenge that I think the industry has is a lot of people want to use NIST CSF, but how do you cycle through it? So great examples. I think the learning point here is it's applicable, but it takes some ingenuity from an assessor perspective, and you have to have that plan going in. Can't tell you how many times I've been in a room where a framework was chosen or a standard was chosen, and they organize everybody at the facility. The assessment or the audit starts, but nobody really took the time to plan and prepare all the core players on what we mean when we ask this question. And when we ask this question, here's the scope that we're going to be focused on. Our next kind of subject is going to be kind of on that thread. We're working at OT and IT teams, but I'll give you the final word on utilization in NIST CSF in an OT environment. What advice do you give to the folks out there?
Yeah, just in general, NIST CSF, ISO 27001, both very applicable in OT environments. Lean on your OT experienced personnel to weigh in the nuances of how those controls can be applied before you go and propose implementing them.
Yeah, very good. And we have one question from the audience. How does a 62443 compare with a with CSF? The simple answer is that CSF is a framework that basically assesses your organization's capabilities to respond based on a cyber attack based on a number of controls that are present. So the outcome you're really looking for in a CSF is a gap assessment of all your different controls. And then a 62443 is really a risk-based methodology that incorporates what we call zones and conduits. If you're interested in learning more about that, message me or check out some of the previous Business of Cyber shows where likelihood of an occurrence, business outcomes, zones and conduits, your overall threats. These are data models that you're going to need to have in place with some element of maturity alongside a NIST-CSF controls gap. And that semblance of that data will help you illuminate what your target security levels need to be and where you need to make changes in your overall kind of security profile. So in more simple terms, NIST-CSF is one of the building blocks to get you to a place where you can implement a 62443 3-2 standard. So really excited to continue the conversation here. Let's talk about teams. The Business Cyber Show is all about what resources do we have out there across time, across people, and across budget. I'd say at least 1 out of 3 times on this show, we're talking about teams and the challenges that teams have. Is NIST-CSF a builder or is it maybe a breaker of OT and IT teams? Your thoughts, Omar?
Definitely a builder, right? Just because of its applicability. I would say it's brought more people within those 2 organizations together than it's taken them apart.
Yeah, I totally agree. So like when we think about, one of the biggest conversations, more comments than we've ever had was about our OT IT convergence. I think that it's an overused term. Convergence of budgets, convergence of maybe kind of go to secure strategies, I think can converge, but actual convergence of the data in any sort of cohesive or comprehensive manner, that becomes very challenging, right?
Yeah.
So how does it help the idea of convergence as a corporate methodology between OT and IT? And what are some of the challenges out there that you see, Omar?
Yeah, and again, giving some credit to the 2 episodes ago with Daniel, one of the hot takes was that IT and OT should never converge, and very much a hot take if you take it without context. But what I really understood was that the networks themselves should not converge, but the people and the objectives definitely should align. I would agree with that. I've heard you specifically, Ted, coin this concept of IT/OT marriage counseling, right? We've been live in front of customers together and we've used that term.
Right.
And that's really what it is. The idea is that you've got to have understanding and definition between both organizations. So understanding the big picture, business strategy, objectives, KPIs, just from a company perspective, right? You're all playing for the same team. You all should be trying to at least steer in the same direction. That's really important. And NIST-CSF, there's a new, within the core function of governance, there's a subcategory that is now organizational context. And it has to do with specifically that is, why are we here? What is our mission? Who are our stakeholders? What are their expectations? What dependencies do we have as a whole company, right? What are some legal, regulatory, contractual ramifications that we have to consider in our day-to-day go to business? And the perspective of IT and the perspective of OT is always going to be slightly different as far as those priorities, but having an understanding from both sides on how you fit in or your organization fits in to the bigger picture is very important.
Yeah. No, I love that they added that because organizational context, I even think it was named correctly. Context is very important in order to bring OT and IT together. I could speak for a long time about why OT teams and IT teams should be separated and why also they should be combined in some way. But the real kind of belief system that I have is that OT has different priorities on a business outcome perspective, right? They're focused on safe and secure, reliable operations. How does OT cyber fit within that? Whereas IT has really a different mission. I think that it's very important for any critical infrastructure asset owner to really look at this new version of NIST-CSF dial in that organizational context. I think that's what the CISO's role is. I think it's the CISO's role to understand the maturity of each side. And then bring a comprehensive mission plan together, rooted in core agreement on syntax. And I think that's where NIST CSF plays its best role, is you have to be able to agree on a certain naming convention and status of controls. And if you can do that effectively, you have laid the foundation for OT and IT within their representative realms to be able to talk about cybersecurity. And I think people don't do that well enough. They say, well, we're going to use 62443 and we're going to use NIST CSF over here, and we're going to use a privacy or a privacy framework on this side of the world, and then way down here we're going to use ISO. And the reason I'm moving like this is because one of the biggest challenges I see is that globally we have more frameworks and standards than we've ever had, and there's different nuances with each of them. None of them are wrong. How do you bring all of those together, Omar? And in an era of increasingly complex data models of controls and control frameworks, how do you pull everybody together? And is NIST CSF the best one to use?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, like you said, I would agree that there's no wrong answer. It's definitely intimidating and complicated as to how many different cybersecurity frameworks and organizations are out there in the world. You talked, and we talked about strategy already. I think the expertise and the experience that practitioners bring into the equation is very important as well. So the tactics and the policies for implementing, whether you pick NIST CSF as your guiding star or 62443 or something else, your tactics and policies could also differ from both groups, and that's okay, right? So, for example, there isn't a NIST CSF control that specifically calls out patching, but patching and providing updates to hardware and software is important. Within IT, it's common practice that you patch every 15 to 30 days, and any IT guy will tell you that that's fine. That frequency is a lot different in OT, right? Where in OT environments, you might not patch at all. You might patch every year, you might patch every half year, and none of those are wrong answers. There's just different perspectives you've got to bring in, because again, in IT, you bring something down, it can be back up quickly. In OT, there's turnarounds, there's a long planning cycle, because in order to take a system to a safe state, for example, if you're in a refinery, right, that might be a multi-day process to take to safe state and then restart. And all of that downtime is lost profit opportunity. And if you're not up and running, right, you're not printing money, and that's a big issue for the company. So just some perspective around how tactics is important. Now, understanding those nuances are just as important as the strategy and which framework you're going to use and align to.
Yeah, it's a big job, and I think that I think security practitioners are not paid enough, to be truthful. It's too much work, and it's getting more complicated. Let's talk about the cyber brain drain. There's not enough people that are out there. There's not enough people resources. So when using NIST CSF as kind of your baselining methodology, are you going to take IT people? Are you going to take OT people? Are you going to, when someone does an assessment of a given facility or 100 facilities, right? There's a lot of people that participate.
Yeah.
How do you recommend that a CISO or any leader views her OT team and her IT team and tries to bring them together when it comes to training? Is one easier to train than the other? I'm putting you on the spot.
Yeah, definitely. I don't want to divide opinion, right? But I'll say that one thing that I've seen be very successful is this concept of internal infiltration, where you can move people from, I mean, they're your employees, right? So whether they're IT people or OT people, and that's where their experience comes from, having cross-pollination, not just in a conference room, but actually taking physically the reporting structure of a really competent OT person and making them report into IT to learn the IT nuances and doing it vice versa. That's one of the best ways, right? And if you do that as a short-term rotation or assignment, they can bring back the learnings to their respective organization and serve as a catalyst for that IT and OT convergence. And you asked me, which do I think is easier to learn, IT or OT? My personal opinion, right? Maybe because I am biased, I grew up in OT, for lack of a better term. I would think that it's easier to teach an OT person cybersecurity than it is for a cybersecurity person to learn OT. And I would say that I could talk about that for a while, but I say probably the biggest contributing factor to that is, you get a lot of different perspective when you're actually out in a refinery or in a manufacturing location, and you see the day to day of how something is manufactured or produced and what the process looks like. That you can't really learn on YouTube. It's really an experience thing, and unless I hear otherwise, I think experience is the best way to teach OT over books and learning. Right? I think those definitely have a place, but experience definitely helps in OT, and that's kind of why I would say if you started in OT, you've got an advantage. Because cyber can definitely be taught versus OT. You got to experience, in my opinion.
Makes sense. I tend to agree with you. Coming from the hard hat, steel toe world myself as a risk manager, and then learning, cyber along the way is just another form of risk management. I'd say I'm proof of that. I also believe that IT security encompasses a huge, huge swath of learnings, right? All the way from networking to system design and architecture. And I think that the average OT person is very mission and business oriented. They know exactly what the outcomes that they're trying to achieve of their systems and their equipment, and they're trained to do that, right? So securing that particular function might be a little bit more siloed, but in a lot of ways that might meet the strategy of the overall organization. Either way, we don't have enough people doing it, so I can't recommend one way or the other. So when you start using NIST CSF, as we kind of bridge towards the latter third of this discussion, let's talk about how do you manage kind of the resource requirements? We've talked a lot about OT and IT working together. We've talked about how some specific examples of how a control can be altered. What are some other things that practitioners that have to go and assess 80 facilities, 100 facilities, different languages, different priorities? What are some things that they can do to implement in the CSF as a true baselining assessment framework?
Yeah, I guess I got to start with another premise, right? So if you agree and if practitioners agree with me that all controls requirements ultimately boil down into three buckets, right? People, process, or technology. If we agree on that premise, the good news is that, whether you take NIST CSF or ISO 27001 or IEC 62443, ultimately the least common denominator for each of those requirements is going to be either people, process, or technology. And NIST CSF, specifically within 2.0, there's a category, platform security, which is talking about really defense in depth and basic, what I'll call cybersecurity hygiene. So yes, there is complexity and resource requirements for implementing CSF controls, but if you just practice basic cybersecurity hygiene, you're going to cover a lot of these, a lot of the things that you need to not have your organization be the weakest gazelle. Again, this is an evergreen journey. There's no 100% way to stay cyber secure. So you just got to do a little bit more than your peers or than your competition to not be the one that ends up on the news. So practicing basic cyber hygiene and hardening around, when you order OT switches, change the default admin name and password, right? Don't have a sticky note on top of the switch. Prevent your firewalls from having rules or ACLs around allow any. Those are the basic things that you can start doing, right? That aren't too terribly complex, that you can implement in an environment today that don't require massive budgets. You don't have to overhaul your entire OT network. You don't have to spend a lot of money on all the cool tech that's shown off at Black Hat and CS4CA. You can, right? They will help, but doing those basic things will help you. And closing thought on that, a common denominator between organizations. So ISA and IEC, NIST, and the Department of Homeland Security ICS cert within the United States. All three of those organizations say, if you practice defense in depth and if you practice segmentation and if you implement an IDMZ, you're already ahead of the game. Like that, those are the big things that they would suggest within this particular NIST CSF category that you do to implement.
Yeah, you bring up a good point. I mean, you don't have to. Did you know that I've actually talked to people who won't go and do an assessment because they don't want on their hands the assessment score, which then in turn somehow creates more or less risk for the practitioner.
Yeah, ignorance is bliss, right?
I mean, I don't know. I live a very, I guess, offensive lifestyle, right? Like the whole reason that I was attracted to the cyberspace, over a decade ago was hackers are really smart and they're going to always find ways to get into the places that you don't want to get into. So, there's a gamification of how can I use limited resources to maximize the security and defense in depth and personnel training processes. Those I think are the real unsung heroes of a real defensive strategy, right? I think there's more than enough content out there about my perspective on the number of products that are out there. We're not short on great products. I think we are short on great people, great policies, great procedures, and great leadership being able to kind of segment all of these different, control gap closure mechanisms in a way that doesn't break the bank. That's one of the reasons that I like NIST CSF, because if you're an asset owner that has, let's say, 75 facilities, most people don't know this coming from IT. Most people don't know this coming for anybody outside of OT, but those 75 facilities don't equal the same level of value on the P&L for the organization. So why would they be able, or should they, deploy the same level of cyber mechanisms at all of them? The truth is, you could argue all day that they should, but will they? And I think the answer is no. So I just think it comes down to a fundamental P&L discussion. How much is it going to cost me to put that control in place? And do I have enough profit left over for that business unit, for that particular facility? This is why NIST CSF, I think, is a really great, all-inclusive, kind of mile wide, 2 inches deep evaluation of your control gaps, because it allows you to look at everything holistically, compare them and say, where are my top gaps? And then match that to some sort of business outcome. Your thoughts, Omar?
Yeah, no, totally agree. I think we'd be having a missed opportunity if we didn't mention that just from a quantity standpoint, there's more controls from a people and process perspective than there are technology, right?
In NIST CSF.
In NIST CSF specifically.
Right. I think it's like 75%, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So even if we went out and bought every single great product that you alluded to,
right,
we still wouldn't have 75% of NIST CSF covered, right? Just to give you some perspective. And the idea of implementing something somewhere is always better than waiting for the perfect time to implement everything everywhere, right? So if you can start a little bit tomorrow, it'll grow over time and you'll mature your practice much faster than if you wait until your CIO approves that multi-million-dollar budget to implement the latest and greatest threat detection solution.
Implementing something somewhere is better than implementing everything everywhere later. Is that what you're saying? You should coin that. I've never heard that, but it's true. I think that too often people use the assessment process and then the assessment outcome to create like this kind of really big milestone that they're trying to achieve. Like every year I'm going to do one of these. I've seen people take NIST CSF by domain, okay? And they've actually gone and assessed maybe 10 or 12, 15 questions, maybe 25. And then they build an entire product or service roadmap to solve some of the gaps. And while that's happening, they come back and they assess a different part of the framework. I think that is a smart way, depending on how you're kind of allocating out your time budget. So very cool. Well, if we talk about, we talked a lot about how to think about NIST CSF, maybe how to deploy it. How do you wrangle your teams to execute on it well? But we haven't talked about how do you measure the effectiveness with NIST CSF. And I'd ask you to talk to the audience a little bit about how do we measure the effectiveness with NIST CSF of our organization's cyber?
Yeah, another premise, right, for the audience. So cybersecurity has to be attainable. All of us answer to someone. And when you have an objective that is dynamic, changes every day, and is never going to end, right? This evergreen concept around cybersecurity, the only way to justify investment and decision making is by quantifying progress, right? And your objective or the finish line is going to change every day, but at least you're moving forward in whatever forward means to your organization. So the most common way is to quantify your company's performance, your cybersecurity performance against compliance for a benchmark or framework like NIST CSF, or maybe a benchmark against one of your peers or your industry group within a particular category like cybersecurity. Whatever your measuring stick is, up to you, but that's the initial step, right? Is figure out what you're going to compare yourself against. If you choose NIST CSF, there is a whole subcategory around oversight now in NIST CSF 2.0. So NIST CSF 2.0 GV.OV, this category is specifically related and designed to help quantify progress against whatever it is that you're measuring, in this case, NIST CSF. So once you figure out your measuring stick, you've got to equip yourself and your team with the right tools to go and measure yourself. A lot of the organizations that I still talk to, Fortune 500 companies, they spend, I'm not going to say invest, I'm specifically going to say spend a lot of time and energy to conduct these assessments, and they don't get anything in return. They use Excel, they use paper and pencil, they send people on flights to different locations around the world. And then once they rally the team, ask the questions, they'll go back to the hotel, skip dinner to create reports. This probably sounds familiar to Ted, right? That's kind of what he had to do in a previous life. And then after all is said and done, these reports are filed away, locked away. No one does anything with them. Next year, in 2 years, they're assessed again, and the posture is at or below the original assessment. So you've got to do something about cyber after you invest the energy and resources into performing these assessments, because an assessment program is definitely not a simple thing to do. It requires a lot of collaboration. So just takeaways, right? Figure out what you're going to measure yourself against, equip yourself with the right tools. Microsoft Office probably isn't the most optimal in 2024. And then once you conduct the assessments, do something with them. Drive some improvement after you get the intelligence or the insight that you're looking for from your risk assessment campaign.
Yeah. You bring up my past. I was cycling through, and one of the things you said made a lot of sense. In my background, I was an ISO auditor. ISO does a really good job with its standards to incorporate an element of self-healing in your auditing structure. What that means is you're not just looking for controls. You're assessing whether those controls are established well enough within the organization, both contextually and procedurally, that if something is not as good as it could be, that the team recognizes and it takes actions. So I think NIST CSF did a really great job of implementing the oversight function that you talked about, because what it really is are you constantly improving your organization? I see this all the time. I did it back when I was an auditor, and now I see it today. Hey, what did we get on that assessment? What was our score? And when you follow up that question with, well, what were you hoping to get? That usually has no answer. I think you bring up something really important, which is if you're just going to do compliance based, all the different controls, how many do you have versus how many are supposed to be there? If you're more of like a maturity level, it really doesn't matter what you are today, because what you are today is based on the resource allocation that you had spent previously in the previous 24 to 36 months. So where you are today is kind of an immovable state. I think where you're going to be tomorrow and what is it going to take to get there, that's the context shift that I think the vast majority of security leaders in the world want to get to today, but they haven't done it. And so, it goes back to NIST CSF being a very good starting point, because it lays out all of the different controls that are generally recommended. Then you figure out where you're gonna head next. So, no, good conversation. How does somebody stay current? I know that there's constantly challenges with NIST CSF as well as others. I mean, just keeping up to date with your library is tough. What kind of advice can you give when people are already kind of keeping up with the threat landscape? the configurations landscape, the training landscape. I can keep going.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the good news is that beyond doing, your basic news hygiene, on staying up to date with the news, current events, et cetera. I mean, even yesterday, right? NIST CSF 2.0 happened to launch, and here we're here the next day talking about it. Definitely something that I would recommend you do. If you're hearing this, you probably already are, right? So there's content that we're putting together that other really smart people in the industry are looking to put together and share, right? Because knowledge is power, and the more we can share with each other, the better, just general industry will be around cybersecurity. But I would be remiss if I didn't use this opportunity to talk about something exciting that I'm taking on as a challenge for myself. I really enjoyed watching the success of this particular show come together, and I'm trying to do something similar. So I'll be having a new series. I'm going to call it Beyond the Framework. And the idea around this series is it'll be pre-recorded. I'll host it. I haven't figured out if I'm going to have guests or not. Probably just going to be myself, at least in the beginning. And if you enjoyed the conversation today, where we actually went deep into the categories, subcategories, or the requirements, that's what I'll be doing on my show, right? So I'll take one framework per week, and I'll take a control or a requirement within that framework. And I'm just going to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly based off of what I've seen in recent past. Again, I've got a unique vantage point with my position and what I get to see. There will be no identifiable information as to who's got the good, the bad, and the ugly. Right. It's more of like, hey, this is what I saw at this particular location, and this is what they struggled with in implementing this control, and this is how you might consider overcoming that. We've got 2 episodes recorded. We're thinking maybe 2 episodes a month at least to start with. And spoiler for episode 1, asset inventory and threat detection is episode 1, and episode 2 is around segmentation. So we'll be talking about NIST CSF and 62443 in those first 2 episodes.
So it's like a deeper dive into what we talked about at the beginning of the show. Take a control or a control family, and then kind of deepen the understanding of what the authors meant. Is that where you're coming from?
Absolutely.
Okay. So this is educational in nature.
Yeah. 5 to 7 minutes, right? Not super time consuming, but just good, bad, and the ugly. Take a control. What does Omar have to share? And you can take it or leave it. And at least it's a data point for you to continue making great decisions around cybersecurity.
Cool. Well, I think maybe you should do a poll on LinkedIn every week or every 2 weeks about, out of this framework, what are the different, sections you want me to cover. I think that there's a lot of people that want to learn more, and they just don't have time to invest in a 2-week course or a 3-day course. And from what you told me before the show, this is like a 5 to 7 minute exercise. So I think you'll be very successful, and I wish you the best of luck. Omar, thanks for joining the show. Thanks for your level of acumen, the level of clarity in the way you talk about NIST CSF. I think hopefully the audience out there got a really great understanding of how they might be able to just apply NIST CSF with a little bit more granularity and specificity to get a little bit more value. My name is Ted. This is the Business of Cyber Show. Omar, thank you so much. Join us next week. We'll be live from S4. I'm not really sure the time and date, but we're excited to be there. We're probably going to be doing some talking about different folks that are there, what their thoughts of the overall show are. And then the following week, I'll be joined by somebody who's going to actually talk to us about the outcomes from S4. And I look forward to sharing both on LinkedIn. Go make it a great day, folks. And when in doubt, the CSF might be something that you can use in your environment. I hope you learned something today. We surely did. Thanks so much.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.